My name is Frank Adamson, and I am a Senior Policy and Research Analyst at Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy and Education. The acronym is SCOPE. We're not a mouthwash, but we are trying to be a culture wash here. And in particular, today I want to talk to you about education. And for the last 5 years, I've been researching the role of privatization in education, particularly in Europe, North America, and Latin America, and as well as in certain sites in the United States. So I'm going to start off by asking a question. In the world of education, the number $4.625 trillion has been bandied about. Does anybody know what that means? What that refers to? It's not the U.S. federal budget is $600 billion. You're close. It's the estimated global expenditure on education per year. And I bring that up because that number was presented, and that number is actually from 2014. It was presented at the International Privatization of Education Conference by Rob Hutter, who is the CEO of Learn Capital, which is a basically a fund that seeks to monetize and profit off of $4.6 trillion. And that number now is about $5 trillion. And that number also, or the conference was put on by the International Finance Corporation, which is the private arm of the World Bank. So that just gives you a little bit of a window into the goals of the different institutions that are involved in the privatization of education at the international level. You have international governmental organizations such as the World Bank, supporting this endeavor. You have venture capitalists, often aligned with technology companies, that seek to monetize and privatize and really just simply profit off of the education marketplace. So I'm going to talk briefly about 3 different things. 1, how do we get here? 2, what works or not in these different countries? And 3, I'm going to just ask you to remember we're asking a fundamental question here. Do governments or market-based systems provide the best education? Right, that's really what we're asking. When we're talking about privatization, what is, in the public sector, what is the best way to do it, right? So in the 70s, the privatization of education really took off in Chile under Pinochet. And he followed the neoliberal advice of Milton Friedman, the privatization of public sectors, in particular, education in 1980 in Chile. And then on the other hand, across the world, you have Finland, which pursued an equity-based approach to their education system as they reformulated their education system. And that led to very different outcomes in the 2000s. So a generation or 2 later, the Chileans had a social movement of hundreds of thousands of people in the street in 2011 protesting against educational inequality, whereas Finland, beginning in 2000 all the way through the current era, has had the consistently highest performance and test scores around the world. So when we look back at the last 40 years of the products of privatization versus a focus on equity and a public investment, the outcomes are pretty clear. Now, Finland and Chile are not the same country. They're not on the same continent. So we do, in a book, which is in my backpack, I'll show you later, we do analyze different countries within the same region. So we look at Finland and Sweden, we look at the US and Canada, and we look at Chile and Cuba. And today, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the US and Canada, because I think that, well, before I do that, I want to say one thing about when we did this book. We were trying to figure out how do we look at all these, there are different phenomena that are happening in different countries, but they're all linked, right? So how do we analyze that, and how do we understand the different trends in these different types of countries? So on the first, if we look at privatization, and there's an interesting concept by one of our book authors who's actually from Finland. He calls the privatization move the global education reform movement, and that's GERM is the acronym there. So we've tracked the spread of the GERM from Chile into the voucher system in the United States in Milwaukee in the 90s, through the charter system today, and in Sweden as well. And so what's happening? There are a lot of different processes at the policy level. There's privatization, but that also can be accompanied by deregulation, decentralization, and market liberalization. And these all occur, and each government highlights them in different ways, but we put them in the bin of a policy approach, right? Why, though? The economic rationales underpinning these approaches. We look at efficiency. There's this argument that the private sector provides more efficient production of resources, right? How do they do that? They do it by providing citizens with choice. And in the education sector today, choice is the main feature, the main promise of charter schools and any privatization move, right? And that choice produces competition. So student choice produces competition, and this is also a competition among schools. And then finally, the governments are using austerity models to claim that there are scarce resources. So that is the kind of rationale for we need to have a more efficient approach to our education system. How does this happen? It happens through voucher systems, like in Chile, where the government gives an individual money, family money, and they can spend it at any school. Vouchers didn't work in the United States because we have a separation of church and state here, so people are uncomfortable with spending money on religious institutions and schools, although that's changing right now. We use charter schools. Sweden uses markets. And the features of this system are standardization and accountability, which means that schools and teachers are accountable through test scores, right? So that's all in this, and we outline it in the book because it's important to think about how each one of these different ways can be manifested in a particular situation. So let's look at the United States. In the United States, the main way we look at it right now is the United States is privatizing, the rationale is choice, and the mechanism is charter schools, right? Now, in Chile, it was privatization, the rationale was choice, but the mechanism was vouchers. And you can see the analytical rationale for this. But in the site of privatization in the United States right now is New Orleans. And I did a 2-year study in New Orleans. The report is available on our website. And basically, what happened in New Orleans was it was sort of set up by the federal government. And again, I'm linking the international organizations, the federal government. How did the federal government set it up? Basically, George Bush took his Texas Miracle into No Child Left Behind, which set up an accountability system based on test scores, which was punitive if you did not meet adequate yearly progress as a school, and then your school was then threatened with closure. And once you have a set of schools that can be closed, you can then take them over with different charter management organizations. And in New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina offered the opportunity to wholesale fire. They fired 7,000 teachers, closed all the schools, reopened them basically as charter schools. And so at the state level in Louisiana, that was supported. And then in order to actually do that, they had to increase the cut point for the test scores There are a lot of things that we described that happened to set the situation up. Yep.
Just real quick, if you could define charter school for the context.
Sure. Charter school is basically a publicly funded, more or less privately run. And when I say privately run, I mean run by a private board that's not appointed democratically. So there are many, I mean, there's, mom and pop charter schools, and then there are charter schools run by charter management organizations that run hundreds of schools. So they're very different types of schools. But in general, the main feature of them is that they have independence from the school district in their governments, and they don't have to, they have a variety of different ways to, they have decision-making about their funding, essentially, is what happens. So that means that, in general, in education, if you want to make money in education, 80% of the funding in education goes to teacher salaries. So what ends up happening is the majority of these schools end up paying their teachers less, so they get less experienced teachers in, often from some place like the Teach for America pipeline, and which brings in college graduates into usually high needs environments with emergency credentials, and you pay them 2/3 of what you would pay a regular teacher, and then you can pocket the rest. And there are a variety of different ways to, nonprofit, for-profit. There's different states view private charter schools as either private or public. The whole issue of calling something private or public is a huge contestation when you're dealing with public tax dollars. But from my perspective, and I think when we think about labor, there is no formal mechanism for democratic oversight over these types of schools. This creates what's called in New Orleans a portfolio district, right? Which is kind of a gesture to a market portfolio where all these different types of schools compete against each other. And what happens is, in a nutshell, I mentioned choice. The idea of the market-based approach is that families will be able to choose different schools, and that competition will produce higher quality. What actually happens is that the schools end up choosing the students because the schools want to have students that can do well on the test, because those are the metrics, right? Yep.
I've read that the charter schools are allowed, the public schools aren't allowed. They're allowed to exclude students who have physical disabilities, handicaps, autism. The public schools have to pretty much encourage, I think, the government to take everyone of a certain age group into a school system. The charter schools can select and say, well, we don't want this person, not because they have, not because they did something wrong, because they don't really fit in with the type of instruction that's being offered. Is that true or not?
Well, on a federal level, that's totally illegal. That is a violation of the IDEA Act to discriminate on disability or any other measure. But that is exactly what happens. So I've interviewed parents in New Orleans who have gone to the charter school fair to figure out what school they should go send their kid to, and the charter school representative says, we don't offer those services, which is an illegal statement. Special needs students, we don't offer services for that student. That's an illegal statement to make. The parent returned the following year, talked to the same person, got the same statement. So this is where you can see that the stratification of students has been institutionalized, right? It's accepted at an institutional level in New Orleans, in the state of Louisiana. And it's really a takeover of a public system in a very particular place in New Orleans. And the law was written so that would happen. And that's happening in other large urban school districts without the political capital to preserve their public control of their schools. So exactly as you said, what we found out is that families are not choosing schools, schools are choosing families. And they do that through a variety of mechanisms in pre-enrollment and during enrollment, kicking kids out because of zero tolerance discipline policies, saying that we're not going to offer services that they're mandated by local, state, and federal policy to provide, because if you're accepting public money, you have to provide this. In a variety of other different ways. I mean, the talk about the terms and means of exclusion is a long conversation, but we outline it in the report. Essentially, what ends up happening is that we've created an increasingly stratified system in New Orleans. It was unequal and stratified before, but now the charter system has created, we identified 3 tiers of schools with 8 sub-tiers, and at each tier, the school performance goes down, and the number of minorities and percentage of minorities goes up, and in particular, African-American students. So at your top-tier school, you have a very beautiful building. I walk into the building, there's no security. I walk around the corner, there are students hanging out in the hallways. I walk into another building at the middle tier, and I'm met at a metal detector, and then I walk into a 3rd-tier school at the lowest tier, and it has 12-foot chain link fence around it, and it's actually run by, one of the schools is run by a company that does corrections in 5 other states. So you're talking about a school-to-prison pipeline. There's no pipeline. It just is already existent. So what... That's the kind of local example of what's happening to students, families, and communities through the privatization of education, and it speaks to the manifestation of the larger venture capital approach to profiting on the $4.6 trillion. And now I'm gonna finish up by saying that it doesn't actually need to go down this way, and this is part of what we highlight in the book, is that for every privatization approach that doesn't work, we've actually identified a public investment approach that does work. So up just north of the border in Ontario, they privatized in the late 90s under conservative government, put vouchers in, changed the orientation of school districts, and the public hated it so much that it became an election issue. In 2003, the privatizers got voted out. They put in a whole school reform model, and they democratically elected a government that actually, one of the things that's interesting for this and germane to this conference is that they have their labor unions sitting down with their government and their family organizations all at the same table, making decisions about what the best situation is for education in that community, in that province, which is a highly diverse province in Canada, and has major urban areas, Toronto, and they still have labor and government at the table. So it's a very different model, one that I think most Americans can't even really imagine because it's been so long since we've actually done that. But I think that that's an important example that I'll finish on, that these different approaches exist in the world. They exist differently. They're totally doable. And what we need to do is coalesce the political will to really understand that the market-based approach in the public sector has not worked, and the public investment approach has been shown to provide high quality and equitable education.
So, are there any questions for Frank?
So, I think what you're talking about has to do with distribution of wealth, right? Obviously, using economic incentives in order to chase metrics, metrics being consumers. Do you see a difference in actual subject matter across the tiered systems? And if so, what is that difference?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're looking in New Orleans, you walk into one of the top tier schools, one of the top performing schools in the state, you're going to have, in addition to AP classes in, the English and math, you're going to have arts, you're going to have extracurricular activities. And as you go down the tiers, you gradually get to greater levels of test prep, because the incentive for those schools is to make incremental gains on their test scores to stay open and receive their per pupil funding. So at the end of the line, you have basically test prep factories where kids sit on computers for most of the day, and they're monitored not really by a certified teacher, but by a monitor, because most of their learning occurs in a blended learning environment. And we ran focus groups of those kids, and they hate it.
You say blended,
Blended learning means a combination of learning via computer and learning from a different person, a teacher or paraprofessional.
Frank?
Do you have any, at least estimate of how much of that $5 trillion is now going to the private charter slash schools, and how much of it is still in the hands of actual public schools?
I would say most of it is still in the hands of public. I mean, probably, I don't even know, definitely above 90%. But for me, it's just a telling statistic I mean, why would you put a number on the global education industry if you weren't intending to take profit from it? Just the entire logic of it is what I think is the most telling part. Now, I will say that in the last 3 months, Liberia has outsourced their education system to a private entity, like an entire country's education system. We're not talking about New Orleans as a city or Tennessee as a state. We're talking about an entire country. And so as you see that begin to happen, I think that number could drastically change. And so that is the point. We are at an inflection point in education right now. How is public education going to be operated going forward? Which is public-private partnerships. And so what is the relationship between public tax dollars and private contributions? And so when I look at that $5 trillion, $4.6 trillion, I'm really talking about what government expenditure on education. So what families are actually putting in as well is additional. And I think that that's another issue. But I think at a base level, we're talking about $4.6 trillion of government money that would then be some portion of it would be allocated to profit for private entities. So it's kind of like, well, as an individual family, you can decide to top up your system, and actually a lot of these, that's what happens in these systems, right? In Chile, you get, say, $3,000 a year for your kid, and then a family gives $100 or $200 or $300, and it provides them incrementally better steps in education. And when I talk to Chileans, they're like, it literally is incremental. They have reproduced social inequality on a line. And so, but that's a different issue than saying, like, we're going to take that $3,000 and, we're going to siphon $1,000 off. So there are multiple issues going on. I think it's important to keep focused on all the different ways that it happens.
I'm horrified to hear you say that term public-private partnership, because I've been working, among other things, around the United Nations for the last few years, and they're using that term continuously, and there's a huge critique of what that means and what that's going to do to all of the UN programs and all of their values that they stand for. And of course, we're always being told that that's necessary to have these partnerships with private entities because of the lack of funding. But the question is, why is there lack of funding? And it's clear that there's this kind of unholy alliance to starve off public entities, and then to say, well, there's not enough money, and so therefore we've got to have these public-private partnerships, and therefore power that comes along with funding is turned over to the private entities. But it sounds like this is a global phenomenon.
It definitely is. I mean, the
And probably some think tank somewhere came up with this and is rolled out.
PPPs. I mean, they have an acronym. It is a phenomenon for sure, and it is manifesting in different ways in different environments. So you have in India, you have the low-fee private schools. There are a lot of different ways that it's happening, and I think I spend time around the UN as well. It's pervasive. That's why I started with the World Bank. What is the World Bank doing with a private arm that's running a conference called the Privatization of Education? It's a very bizarre